The Pharisees arose from a philosophy of Hasidim. Okay? It was a conservative philosophy, a conservative movement. They fought against forced Hellenism. It was mentioned at the time of Judas Maccabeus. Week 932, Part 2, Lifestyle. Now, you've seen this chart before, and I like to use the quote. If you have my book, you go to the Part 2 separator between the history part, which we covered, chapters 1 through 11, and Part 2, which is Lifestyle. And I use the quote from Forrest Gump. It says, Mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And sometimes you might wonder what that really means. So I put it into a little animation here. So there's lots of different things we can get. Zealots, Scribes, Tisha B'Av, Pharisees, Hanukkah, Yamashoa, Purim, Herodians, Essenes, Pesach, Yom Kippur, Sanhedrin, Sadducees, Lag Bomer, Sukkot, and those are all things we'll just cover this week and next. Now, I thought about going and putting every term we're going to cover in the next 5 chapters and doing a chart of that, and I discovered when I started doing that there's just no way I can do that without spending a bunch of time. But we will get to a bunch of other stuff, and some of the stuff in general that we will get to are all Jewish feasts and holidays. A lot of those are mentioned here in this box of chocolate. Okay, the Jewish temples, synagogues, Sanhedrin, priesthood, Septuagint, Apocrypha, Gemara, Tisha, the Talmud, the Mishnah, all these different things that we're going to get to. But those are just a few of the terms. Money, we'll get to money, debasement, Greek, Jewish, Roman money, what money looks like, Greek and Roman gods, family, slavery, lots and lots of stuff coming up. That's why chapter 12 through 16 are like a box of chocolates. And I decided that I really needed a bigger box of chocolates to do my animation here. So what I did was, I have a box of chocolates that you can pass around.
There's only 2 pieces left.
yeah. I also have a bowl in here for those of you that don't like chocolate. I have a bowl of taffies. Now, the thing about a box of chocolates is sometimes you get something that's just gross, like coconut. Anybody in here like coconut? No way. What is wrong with you people? Please eat all the coconuts from the box. So whatever's left over, I don't get one by accident. Okay? It's going to be the same thing with our class. Okay? There's going to be things that you might not appreciate. My wife doesn't appreciate ancient money. I think it's one of the coolest things ever to figure out how the money changers at the temple, what they had to deal with. And I think it gives you a new appreciation for these people. I mean, they were crooks. They were charging an arm and a leg for the service. They were crooks for sure. But it gives you an appreciation for what they had to deal with. They had to deal with all these different denominations. They had to deal with the different kinds, Jewish, Roman, Greek money. They had a lot to deal with. Okay? So we will cover that in detail. That may not be your cup of tea. Well, you know what chapters are coming up, so go to a different class that day, I guess. Other things may be your cup of tea. When I was writing the book, something that was not my cup of tea was Roman gods, Roman and Greek gods. I thought, I really don't care. I don't care about Greek mythology that much, okay? I thought it was important to write about it because it definitely affected early Christians, right? And the divinity of the Roman emperor, that affected early Christians, right? Okay, so I wrote about that in chapter 15, so we'll get to that. That may not be your cup of tea either, okay? But all these things are a box of chocolates. There's going to be a wide range of subjects. And we've covered the bases. When I go through and I'll say, this happened in the Hasmonean period or whatever, you'll say, oh, I remember that from week 2. And here we are in week 932. So we will cover history. Well, we'll cover things in the context of the history that we've already covered. When life gives you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate. I like that quote. I don't know who said that, but it's a good quote. All right. Now, I want to cover a couple things, 4th of July and history-wise first. I love this quote. I came across it in all the 4th of July emails and stuff that I got. This was John Adams during the American Revolution writing to his wife, Abigail. He said, I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Isn't that true? He's one of our founding fathers, and I definitely appreciate the things that he did as one of our founding fathers. Another thing about mathematics, a generation which ignores history has no past and no future. We spend a lot of time on history. Some of you may have gotten bogged down in the history. I know that times I did, in writing about it and even talking about it in class, okay? But the history really does set the context for everything that is to come, okay? Chapter 12 of the book is Jewish politics, holidays, and institutions. We'll spend at least 2, probably 3 weeks in this chapter. It's a big chapter. It's 50-something pages. In about 3 weeks probably from now, we'll study the writings of the Intertestament period. The Septuagint was a big one. The Apocrypha is a big one. First and Second Maccabees, all the Apocrypha, all the books of the Apocrypha are big ones, okay? The Mishnah, the Talmud, we'll talk about all those different writings that we touched on in week 1 or 2, okay? We'll delve more into the details when we get to that. Chapter 14, money and weights, the things they had to deal with in New Testament times with money, the different money pieces and the weights. Chapter 15, life in the ancient world, we'll cover slavery, buildings, Roman aqueducts, Roman concrete, things like that. And chapter 16, we'll kind of wrap it up with the bigger picture. Okay? So chapter 12, Jewish politics, holidays, and institutions. We'll start with Jewish politics. Now, we already covered the history. You should be familiar with this chart very much. Okay? We looked at, back when we did the history, we looked at details of the slices of history. Okay? The end of the Old Testament was the end of the Persian period. Okay? The good kings of Persia allowed the Jews to come back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Okay? But then a guy named Alexander the Great came along. And he took Judea in 332 BC. And the Persians were done. I mean, he just really wiped them out. They were completely done. Okay? But during this period, he was very short-lived as a king, okay, over all this region that he conquered. But then his descendants took over, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies. Okay? Alexander the Great introduced unforced Hellenism to the region. He was the apostle of Hellenism. And I told you before, Greek way of thinking, of doing, of being, Hellenism. Okay? Next up, Antiochus IV Epiphanes introduced forced Hellenism. He said, you will be Hellenized or else you will be tortured. You will be killed. Your children will be killed. We've read story after story after story of a mother watching her 7 children get killed, one after the other. Forced Hellenism. And then we see Mattathias rebelling against forced Hellenism. So in this period of the Alexander the Great and the Diadochi, okay, we see the birth of the philosophies, Hellenism and Orthodox Judaism. Okay, now Orthodox Judaism was around for a while, but Hellenism came on the scene with Alexander the Great, forced by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and then rebelled against by Mattathias and his sons. So the birth of philosophies came during the Diadochi period. Next up, the Maccabees and Hasmoneans. When Antiochus IV was finally kicked out of Judea by Mattathias, we see the period of independence of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans. Okay, we see Judas Maccabee was supported by the Hasidians. Who were they? We talked about that already a little bit before, but everything we've talked about before was history with, oh, by the way, here's some politics. Okay, now we're talking about politics. Oh, and oh, by the way, here's the history that supports it. You see the distinction that I'm making? Okay, so the Hasidians were just a group of people. We see them mentioned in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, where they supported Judas and his father, Mattathias. Okay, we see legitimization of the high priesthood, of the non-Zadok high priesthood with Simon. Now, I misspoke a time or two, I think. It actually have an error in my book I need to put in the errata. But I said that the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans was a transfer of the priesthood from an Aaronic line to a non-Aaronic line. Okay, it really was not that. The Maccabees were still priests of the Aaronic line, but they were not of the line of Zadok. Okay, now if you've never heard of Zadok, he was the high priest during David and Solomon. Okay, his lineage continued on down through here. Okay, well, more specifically down to when Menelaus was chosen by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Okay, so they were really Aaronic, but they were the non-Zadok. So a little bit of a change there. Then by the time we get to Herod the Great, the high priesthood became a completely political office. Yes?
So today, considering the fact that the Jews don't have a priest, any kind of high priest, priesthood, or whatever, like, how is that even an organized religion? Period. Like, what is their justification around that?
Their justification came during the Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple completely. They were taken off in Babylon, and they started synagogues. We'll talk about that a little bit later on today, maybe next week. Since we have more time today, maybe we can talk about it today. Okay? So synagogues became the place of worship. When they came back to Jerusalem, they rebuilt the temple and the walls. Okay? So then they started having the two forms of worship. Synagogue worship controlled by the Pharisees primarily, temple worship controlled by the Sadducees primarily. Okay? When the temple was destroyed again, they went to just synagogues, basically. Orthodox Judaism
so
kind of.
Basically used that piece of history at captivity and just said, we're going to do this again.
Yeah. They had to have a place to worship, so they created a synagogue, basically. Yeah. Okay. All right, next up. John Hyrcanus was first a Pharisee, then a Sadducee. Hellenism faded and Sadduceeism rose. A lot of things happened during the period of John Hyrcanus. Okay. We see Hellenism start to be not talked about anymore. You know, that's kind of an old archaic term, kind of like Ride Out Road. It's now Research Park Boulevard, don't you know? So Hellenism faded and Sadduceeism rose. Okay, we see him that talked about during his reign. Okay, we see the Pharisees being talked about during his reign also. Okay, so we see a switch, a molding of this philosophy of Orthodox Judaism or conservatism into Phariseeism, and a more liberal philosophy of Hellenism going into Sadduceeism, okay, during John Hyrcanus' time. Alexander Jannaeus was a staunch Sadducee, okay. Salome Alexander, she was a laid-back Pharisee. You remember this history? They were husband and wife. He was a staunch Sadducee. He was so bad, he crucified Pharisees, bad to the Pharisees. And he told his wife, he said, when I die, you give my body to the Pharisees, you let them do whatever they want to do to me, and then you can reign. And she did, and she was able to reign as a pretty good leader, actually, okay, as a Pharisee leader. We see then that their two sons, Jannaeus and Salome Alexander, their two sons, Aristobulus was a staunch Sadducee, and Hyrcanus II, his brother, a staunch, or more of a laid-back, I'd say he's more like his mom, more of a laid-back Pharisee. One in charge of the military, one in charge of the priesthood. What could go wrong? Well, we studied that history, but now we're just looking at history and kind of the background. We're looking at politics now, okay? So we see this rise of the philosophical sects. Conservatism, Orthodox Judaism, Hasidim, okay, evolving into Phariseeism. Hellenism evolving into Sadduceeism. Okay. In addition to Phariseeism, okay, so we also have the Essenes. It's kind of a subgroup of the Pharisees. Okay. All right. Next up, Herod and the Romans. Okay. You remember this chart from back whenever it was? We see that when the Romans took over, we saw the rise of the Zealots. Okay. The Zealots were anti-Rome. Everything Rome, don't want Rome. Okay. We also saw when Herod the Great came along the rise of the Herodians. The Herodians were all in on Herod the Great. He was a great guy, according to the Herodians. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So here we see the birth of the political sects, okay? So philosophical, now political, okay? Because it all has to do with Rome. Who's in charge? Who's my guy? Who's in charge of my life? Herod the Great, okay? Who's in charge of my life? The Romans, okay? So the sect of the Zealots and the sect of the Herodians comes along at this time, during the Herodian and Roman period. This chart I showed you too back in the history time, but now we're looking at it again from a politics point of view. So we know that Alexander the Great had a huge influence on the culture because he brought in Hellenism, unforced Hellenism. This was in direct conflict with Orthodox Judaism. Antiochus IV Epiphanes forced it, as I mentioned before. Mattathias rebelled. The Hasmoneans had a great influence on geography, politics, and religion, perhaps even more than the Romans or the Herodians. Wow. So we see the transition of the high priesthood from a Zadok to a Hasmonean lineage, where Simon Maccabee became the Jews' leader and high priest forever. Once the Hasmoneans died out, we see the high priesthood become a political office at the whim of whoever was ruling at the time, whether it's Herod the Great, Herod Archelaus, whoever. They became appointed by the prefects and procurators later on. If you're interested in the details of that, go to chapter D in the appendix. There is not a list that I could find of all the high priests in Israel until I did my book that I know of. I had to piece that. When I started writing that appendix, I said, why in the world did I start doing this? But anyway, so it is what it is. I don't know if it's complete or not, but it may be the best thing out there. I don't know. But you can go and see who was picked by who, which high priests were picked by which political leader, okay, starting in the Hasmonean period. We see the rise of the Pharisees and Sadducees during the Hasmonean period, and we see the oppressed becoming the oppressor, during the Hasmonean period when John Hyrcanus and others started forcing their beliefs on the ones they conquered. And then Herod the Great ruled with an iron fist at the will of Rome. So those are the main guys, I think, historically, that bleed into the politics of the period. Okay? So the beginning of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, if you were here at my talks, my all-day talks back 11 months ago now, goodness gracious, my Sunday morning class and Sunday night class, okay, this chart should be very familiar to you because it's the exact same chart that I did back then. Anybody remember this at all? Okay. Yay, some. Yay. All right. All right. So, I love this saying, hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Up here, hard times began with Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 167 BC, when he came in and forced people to do what he said, forced people to the Greek way of doing and thinking and living, and if you didn't, he would kill you. Hard times. Then along came some good men. Mattathias, Papa Mac, Judas Maccabee, who rededicated the temple in 164 BC. Jonathan, where the high priest line changed to a Maccabean or Hasmonean line instead of a Zadok line. Simon, where the high priesthood became legitimized. He became their leader and high priest forever. Okay? John Hyrcanus, we see the first mention of the Pharisees and Sadducees about 120 years before the beginning of the New Testament. He was first a Pharisee, then became a Sadducee. Strong men create good times. This is what good times look like. I showed you 11 months ago the battle-to-peace treaty ratio of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, okay? And the territory that was gained in each one. So the little blue area there is controlled by Judas. I'm having trouble seeing that from here, okay? So just a little area. And then it was added to by Jonathan in purple, Simon in orange, green was John Hyrcanus, yellow was Aristobulus I, and then Alexander Jannaeus in brown. So we see the entire region controlled by the Hasmoneans at the end of the Hasmonean period, okay? Good times. That is an indicator of good times. If you look at the battle of peace treaty ratio down here, we had just battles. We had a bunch of battles, just a few little peace treaties. We started getting like an even number of battles and peace treaties. Good times, right? When you're not fighting a war and you're having peace treaties, it's good times. And then by the time Simon came along, more peace treaties than battles. But good times inevitably lead to weak men. Then we have the weak men of the period. Aristobulus I, he was a Sadducee. He was absolutely brutal to his family. We talked about that historically. Next up, Alexander Jannaeus. He was brutal to the Pharisees. We talked about him crucifying them. They found the grave, they think a mass grave of all the Pharisees that he killed, and their wives and their children. All these cut bones and stuff in this mass grave. He was brutal to the Pharisees. And Salome Alexander, kind of a bright light in the midst of all this badness. She was a pretty good leader, actually. And she was a Pharisee. And Pharisees grew greatly in power during her reign. And then we're back to Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Now, Hyrcanus was not really a bad guy that I can tell. Aristobulus was. But they were fighting against each other because of their beliefs. Pharisee, Hyrcanus, Sadducee, Aristobulus. What could go wrong? Well, what went wrong was they both appealed to Rome, and Rome came in under the guise of Pompey in 63 BC and took over the region and forced Roman control on the region. Hard times were back again after this cycle of hard times, strong men, good times, weak men, back to hard times. Okay? Now, I've mentioned this 2 or 3 times already, but I want to put it in graphic form. The Pharisees arose from a philosophy of Hasidim. Okay? It was a conservative philosophy, a conservative movement. They fought against forced Hellenism. It was mentioned at the time of Judas Maccabeus. Okay? Which came first, Hasidim philosophy or the Hasideans? Who knows? You could flop those two if you wanted to. You know, one begat the other or vice versa. Okay? But the Hasideans are mentioned in the Apocrypha and First Maccabees and Second Maccabees in the context of Mattathias and the context of his son Judas. Okay, so we see this rumbling of the philosophy getting started in the intertestament period at the time of the Maccabees. Okay, those then transformed into the Pharisees and Essenes. Okay, the Pharisees dominated the synagogues that we just mentioned. They became stronger during the rule of Salome Alexander, as we just mentioned. A continuation of Orthodox Judaism. They wanted political and religious liberty, particularly the school of Shammai. We'll talk about that in just a second. And they did not care as much for political liberty in the school of Hillel. This distinguished them from the Maccabee brothers, who were very interested in politics, who were very interested in kicking out the Seleucids out of the region and not being forced into Hellenism again. Okay? So that is the beginning. That is the morphing of the Pharisees. The Sadducees. Oh, by the way, if you go to Israel today, you'll see people running around like that. These are Orthodox Jews. Okay? You'll see them everywhere, running the streets. You'll see them at the Western Wall, praying there, whatever. Even they'll bring their chairs up to the Western Wall and stay there all day, kind of thing. So these are really Orthodox Jews that arose kind of from this philosophy of Phariseeism, specifically the school of Hillel. We'll talk about that in just a second. Sadducees, okay? The Hasmonean dynasty, surprisingly, is what spun out the Sadducees, which is kind of weird because you don't think of those two really together. The Sadducees were very okay with Rome being occupiers. The Maccabees were not. The Hasmoneans were not. But let's look at how that transition happened. The Hasmonean dynasty was a transfer of the priesthood from a Zadok to a Maccabean line. Started with Jonathan and became official with Simon, who became their leader and high priest forever. We see Hellenization arise during John Hyrcanus. That's Simon's son. Sadducees, who ended up becoming this more from Hellenism, they leaned toward Hellenism later in his life, or John Hyrcanus did. It moved from a philosophy of Hellenization to a sect of the Sadducees during John's rule. And then the Sadducees ended up dominating the priesthood and the Sanhedrin. This picture here is a picture I took in the Holy Temple Visitor Center in Jerusalem, where they have recreated all the implements that go into the temple. They have a Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. They have the tables of showbread. They have the golden candlestick, which is actually outside, kind of on a platform above the Western Wall plaza. It's in a case, but you can go see this giant 7-stick candlestick, right? 7-branch candlestick. Remember, not a non-branch. That's a menorah for Hanukkah, but the 7-branch for the temple services. Okay, we talked about that 2 or 3 weeks ago. All right. Where am I going with this? Oh, this picture. So this is the high priest garments. This is kind of what I think of when I think of a Sadducee. Kind of they're highfalutin kind of guys. They're the high political class society, whereas Pharisees are more kind of, yeah, we're just common guys. We're just common people. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Like today, okay, we have, back then they had Hasidim, the philosophy morphed into the sect of the Pharisees. Hellenization, the philosophy morphed into the sect of the Sadducees. Like today, we have conservatives who kind of morph into the Republican Party. We have liberals that kind of morph into the Democrat Party, kind of the way things are, the way they've always been, right? You got conservative, you got liberals, and they have their parties or their sects that deal with those different principles. All right. Now, I showed you this chart before too, but now in the political context, we think that probably the sons of Mattathias, the ones who lived, John and Eleazar did not live. One was squished by an elephant, remember that? And one was killed by Nabatean Arabs, if I remember correctly. 3 sons, Judas, Jonathan, Simon. They were probably pre-Pharisee because we know the Hasideans were helping them. So this philosophy that morphed into the Pharisees, these people and this philosophy that morphed into the Pharisees were helping the Maccabees early on. So they were probably pre-Pharisees before Pharisee was cool. Okay. John Hyrcanus. We see Pharisees and Sadducees mentioned for the first time. He was first a Pharisee, and then because somebody made a comment about his mother, literally, if you go read the text, we talked about this back in the day, but somebody made a comment about his mother, and it changed him completely from being a Pharisee to a Sadducee. Wow! Quite a transition, okay? So he became a Sadducee, and his kids, Aristobulus I, Alexander Jannaeus, they became staunch Sadducees, okay? We talked about them in the detail then. And then the 2 sons of Salome Alexander and Alexander Jannaeus, Hyrcanus, a Pharisee, Aristobulus II, a Sadducee. Hyrcanus was in charge of the temple and religion, which is an odd thing because Sadducees were generally in charge of the temple, but he was high priest. Aristobulus was in charge of the military. That was a mistake. That was a mistake by the mom, Salome Alexander, who set that up, because that set up Rome to come in finally and conquer the territory in 63 BC. Some comparisons of Sadducees and Pharisees. The institution of the Pharisees was synagogues, whereas the Sadducees was temple and the priesthood. The Sanhedrin, there are a few Pharisees in there. The ones that were in there were probably of the school of Shammai. We'll talk about that in the next bullet, but hang on just a second, okay? The majority of the Sanhedrin were made up by Sadducees, okay? Schools of thought. The Sadducees were fairly cohesive. They had kind of the same school of thought. The Pharisees had two different schools of thought. They had the school of Shammai. They were ultra-religious fundamentalists, founded shortly before Jesus was born. And then there was a school of Hillel, who was the grandfather of Gamaliel, okay, a very famous person in the New Testament. We know that Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel, so we know that Paul was of the school of Hillel. This is the roots of modern-day Judaism. They emphasized compassion and practicality. Okay? I think of it as kind of like these two different schools. They're both Pharisees, but they have different philosophies. And I'm going to bring it to modern-day politics if I can. I think of the MAGA people, and I think of the never-Trumpers. Both Republicans, they're kind of at each other's throats, right? They're in the same party, but they're at each other's throat. Kind of like the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. We will see some examples of the schools of Shammai and Hillel in the Bible, I think. I'll show you what just my personal opinion, what it is. Okay, but hang on for that. Philosophy and culture. The Pharisees believed Roman occupation was punishment for sins. The Sadducees were Hellenized and they collaborated with Rome. Okay, status. Pharisees mostly middle class. They mingled with the regular people. Sadducees did not. They were wealthy and aristocratic. They went and did their temple duty things, and they didn't mingle with the people. Jesus' attitude toward the Pharisees was very critical oftentimes. Toward the Sadducees was moderate. Why is that? I'll talk about that in just a minute. Hang on. Practices. The Pharisees had an in-depth knowledge of the law. They proselytized Gentiles. They opposed Jesus because why? He didn't believe in the oral law, and the Pharisees did. I'll get to that in just a minute. We're getting there. Okay. They often had a haughty attitude. They practiced self-denial and fasting, kept separate from sinners. Okay, that was a big complaint they had with Jesus, that he mingled with sinners. Oh my. Most of the Jewish population looked up to the religious authority and they shunned non-Pharisees. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were irreligious, a closed club. They didn't care if anyone else came along. They embraced Hellenism. They were politically involved, and they were very materialistic. Final disposition. Okay, going back to Craig's point. The school of the Pharisees evolved, and more specifically the school of Hillel, evolved into Orthodox Judaism. Okay, the Sadducees, they were done in AD 70 with the end and destruction of the temple. So they pretty much dried up after AD 70. Now, what did they believe in? The Pharisees believed the righteous are resurrected in new bodies. They believed in angels and spirits. They believed in the Messiah, but not Jesus. They believed in the Mosaic Law, the entirety of the Old Testament, and the oral law. The Sadducees didn't believe anything. They were sad, you see. They didn't believe anything. I'd be sad too if I didn't believe anything. They did believe in the first 5 books of the law, though. Known as, you've heard the term Pentateuch? First 5 books of the law, the Deuterocanonical books, Genesis or Deuteronomy, okay? So they believed in those books. Both of them believed in those books, but the Pharisees added a bunch to it. Okay, they added the rest of the law and prophets that we have as our Old Testament. Okay, they also added the oral law. The oral law would soon become written into something called the written oral law or the Mishnah. And then they had a commentary on the Mishnah called the Gemara, and the Mishnah and Gemara combined become the Talmud. That's what Jews study today. When you go to Bible class as a Jew, you go to Talmud study because you're studying the entirety of it. You're studying not just the Bible, the Old Testament, you're studying the Talmud, the oral law, and the commentaries on the oral law. We'll talk about that in a lot of detail in a few weeks. Next up, some final thoughts on the Pharisees. They viewed Hellenism as a corruption. Their names, the Pharisees' name means separated ones. They were religiously self-righteous. I'm concerned about that today, about self-righteousness. Their philosophy is more akin to the first Maccabees than that of their descendants. They believed in a Messiah. It's just their Messiah would free them from Roman rule. Jesus wasn't there to do that. He was there to set up a completely different kind of kingdom. Their Messiah would make them officers in that kingdom. And Jesus wasn't interested in that. Whoever is the least shall be greatest. Yeah. Their Messiah will eat with them, not harlots or publicans, sinners. Really? Their Messiah would praise them for their goodness and their righteousness. They added the scriptures with the oral law. As I mentioned before, this was the Mishnah, the Gemara, the commentary, both of those combined was a Talmud. Prominent Pharisees, probably all these were the school of Hillel. But the Saul of Tarsus was of the school of Hillel, we know that. Joseph of Arimathea, who buried the body of Jesus, probably from the school of Hillel. Nicodemus, perhaps from the school of Hillel. Gamaliel, Saul's teacher, definitely of the school of Hillel. And Josephus, the famous historian, don't know, maybe the school of Hillel. The Sadducees, some final thoughts. John Hyrcanus I and his progeny ultimately embraced and even enforced Hellenism. Wow. The very culture his grandfather and father had fought so hard against by kicking Antiochus IV and the Seleucids out of the region. But he just went all in on Hellenism. The Maccabees, that family, morphed into this sect of the Sadducees. Man, it doesn't take many generations to go wrong, does it? Anybody ever see that in your lives? Doesn't take many generations to go wrong. Okay. They were sad, you see, as I mentioned. They dominated the priesthood and the Sanhedrin starting the time of the Hasmoneans. They were very unpopular with the people. Their history was relatively brief, about 200 years, and then with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Why did Jesus mostly leave them alone? I've wondered about this before. Why? Why? And I'm going to show you how many verses there are about the Sadducees and the Pharisees in just a minute. But why did Jesus mostly leave them alone? Well, perhaps he knew their history was short. Why fool with them? They're going to be gone in 30 years. And they were. Or perhaps he just had fewer interactions with them. Remember, they were haughty. Well, the Pharisees were too a little bit. You know, we don't want to mingle with sinners, but at least the Pharisees were out there with the population. The Sadducees were not. Jesus may just not have had opportunity to mingle with them as much. Okay? Next up, Herodians and Zealots. So remember, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were philosophical sects. Okay? Whereas the Herodians and Zealots were political sects. Herodians embraced Roman rule. Wanted Herod's bloodline to stay in power. They were typically wealthy. It began with Antipater II, who was the father of Herod the Great, and ended with Herod Agrippa II. Generation 4, remember Generation 4, BDL, birth, death, early apostles, late apostles. Some of you, okay, good. Generation 4, Herod Agrippa II, ended with him. Some Herodians may have, this blows my mind, but may have considered Herod the Great to be the Messiah. Yeah, it's kind of hard to understand. But you have to say, Jerusalem mostly enjoyed peace and prosperity under the Herodian family. Herod the Great was a prolific builder. What better way to get people's vote of confidence to build cool stuff? He built the cool temple. He built all kinds of palaces, all kinds of stuff around Judea, everywhere, Masada, everywhere. Wow, what a builder. Herodians were Jews, but were dedicated to the philosophy of Hellenism. Okay? Zealots. They were anti-Rome. They wanted to drive them out at any cost. They were not interested in peace. They despised everything Roman, the occupation, the taxes, the rulers, the soldiers, everything. And they didn't care what it took to get them out. Violence, that's A-OK with the Zealots, okay? They refused to pay taxes. They believed only God had the right to rule over Jews. They were a militant segment of the Pharisee party. Fanatic in their faith, they used terrorism against Rome and others who did not agree with them. We saw that the reason Jerusalem fell, historically, okay, was because of the politics of the Zealots. If you weren't for them, you were against them. If you wanted to go ahead and open the doors of Jerusalem, let the Romans in, to let them take over peacefully, yeah, we might have to do some slavery and whatever, but, you know, we'll be alive. We won't be crucified. The Zealots were not into that at all. They would kill their fellow Jerusalemites to keep them from doing that. Okay? They were first mentioned in Josephus regarding Judas, the Galilean, who led a revolt in AD 6. Whereas the Sadducees were blood children of the Maccabees, the Zealots were their spiritual children. Does that make sense? The Maccabees were very anti-blank. They were very anti-Seleucid, right? The Zealots were very anti-Rome. Seleucids were the political rulers during the time of the Maccabees. The Romans were the political rulers during the time of the Zealots, okay? So they were their spiritual children. They were mostly ended, like the Sadducees, in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple, and AD 73 with the fall of Masada. Now, they kind of continued on a while. They were still making trouble in Alexandria and places. But some of the Jews said, that's enough. We're just going to take these people to Rome. We're just done with the Zealots. And the Jews kind of had kind of like an internal rebellion and kind of took the Zealots and took them to Rome and said, we're done with these people. Go ahead and kill them. Or whatever. So the Zealots are pretty much done. AD 73, 4 or 5, somewhere in there. Okay? The Essenes, they were another conservative party like the Pharisees. They rejected temple worship. They believed all matter was evil and rejected all worldly pleasure. They aimed to be poor, strict self-denial. They required an extended probation to join their sect. The Essenes did not care about politics at all. They went off to these lone places like Qumran, where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay, and they did copying of the Dead Sea Scrolls and hiding the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. You go to the shrine of the book in Jerusalem today and see the scroll of Isaiah, this giant book unrolled. Really cool. All the different fragments they found in the shrine of the book. These were the Essenes that probably did this. They rose from the Hasidians, like the Pharisees. Philosophically rose from the Pharisees. They were a priestly sect, like the Sadducees. They were fanatic preservers of Scripture. Thank goodness we have the scrolls, right? They were strict observers of the Sabbath, so much so they would not even defecate on that day. Wow, that's pretty strict. Whatever the Essenes say is firmer than an oath, for they say that he who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned. If you got an Essene and you want him to tell the truth, or you asked him any question, he would tell you the truth. Okay? They could endure any torture with a smile and would not blaspheme God. They would not blaspheme Moses, who they considered equal with God, or almost equal with God. But they would never do that, no matter how much you tortured them, whatever. They would smile at you and say, not going to do it. They believed in spiritual immortality, and they were defeated by Rome and ultimately died out. We know that Rome probably took Qumran during that time of the, I don't remember exactly when, but during that conquest between 67 and 73, they took Qumran. Now, two New Testament occupations. Publicans, who were tax collectors. They were faithful to Rome, complete opposite of the Zealots. They were despised by the general population. They were Rome's internal revenue service. They collected taxes, and then whatever they collected beyond the tax was theirs to keep. That's why they were hated by the people. You know, they would collect whatever they could, which is how they made their living. The Apostle Matthew was a publican. The hot challenge Zacchaeus was a publican, and he was an honest publican, which is really an oxymoron because they didn't really exist back then, except for maybe just Zacchaeus and maybe Matthew. Okay, Scribes, copiers of Scripture, typically held in high regard. Intimately familiar with Mosaic law, they were essentially the creators and interpreters of the law. Jesus typically viewed the scribes with displeasure as he did the Pharisees. We see 62 verses for scribes versus 84 for Pharisees. Okay? Perhaps Jesus' biggest miracle was that he used a publican, Matthew, and a zealot, Simon Zelotes, at the same time as apostles. Wow! That's like putting a Democrat and a Republican in the same room, right? And saying, get along! Work together! Jesus was able to do that with a publican and a zealot. Now, notional depiction of the size and overlap of the sects. Every time I put this chart up, I do have this in my book, I get kind of nervous about it because this is really a notional thing that I came up with. So how different sects overlap with each other. So scribes, zealots, Essenes really overlap with the Pharisees. The Pharisees divided between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Now, when I think of the school of Hillel, I think of someone that just kind of listens to people and whatever. When I think of the school of Shammai, I think of, they're very, this is the way it is, and if you don't think that way, then I have nothing to do with you. And the school of Hillel is thinking, I might want to listen to your opinion. What do you think about that? You know, maybe I can learn from the way you think, okay? We see that manifested in the Bible, I think. We see a possible interaction between the school of Shammai and Hillel, with Jesus healing the blind man in John 9. Some of the Pharisees, my parentheses, perhaps of the school of Shammai said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the, see the language there? For he does not observe the Sabbath. Boom, 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 boom. That's the way it is. You better listen to me. I don't care about your opinion. But others, possibly the school of Hillel, said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. I really do think that's probably an interaction between those different schools of philosophy of the Pharisees. We see an interaction between Sadducees and Pharisees in Acts 22 through 23. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee. Oh, wait. He believes in resurrection as a Pharisee, right? A son of Pharisees. I'm on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Why? Because one believed in resurrection, one did not. Paul said, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And he started the people fighting with each other. He's a great guy. I think it's so cool the way he could do that. And the assembly was divided. Cool. Pharisees in the Bible. Quickly, we'll wrap this up, I hope. So I put in red things that are negative about Pharisees. There's a lot of verses about the Pharisees. I put in black things that are neutral, and green things that are positive. Okay? Let me give you a couple of examples. Matthew 3:7. It said, when he saw many Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, this was John the Baptist, he said to them, you brood of vipers. Is that a good thing? That's not a good thing. Okay? Who warns you to flee from the wrath to come? Matthew 9:11 is a neutral passage. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, I don't know if they were saying that, asking that question to set something up, or were they asking that question as a question? You know, we don't eat with tax collectors. We're Pharisees. We don't eat with tax collectors and sinners. Why does your master eat with them? So maybe just a legitimate question. In green, Luke 13:31, we see, at the very hour some Pharisees came and said to him, to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." That's a good thing. They warned Jesus that Herod was out to kill them. Okay? So how does that stack up? You remember this from the talk 11 months ago? The good, the bad, and the ugly, or in our case, the good, the bad, and the neutral. So we see a lot of bad for the Pharisees and a lot of neutral and not very much good. Sadducees, same deal, but not nearly as many verses. Jesus did not have as much to do with the Sadducees, as I said, as he did with the Pharisees. Red, bad, black, neutral, nothing good said about the Sadducees. It's kind of depressing, I guess. And here's how they stack up on our scale. The good, the bad, and the neutral. Yeah, a lot of bad, just a couple neutral. Okay? Next week, we'll talk about Jewish institutions. Appreciate y'all being here. Please eat more candy. Please eat more. My wife is begging for us to eat more candy. See y'all next week.